Now, I couldn't finish a storytelling video review without talking about the biggest field of storytelling games, and that's tabletop RPGs. I want to talk briefly about a couple of these big ones that are out there to let you know exactly what they're all about. First of all, we have Dungeons and Dragons, which everyone has heard of, but not a lot of people know what actually goes on in a game. Now, Dungeons and Dragons simply has one character playing as a dungeon master, who designs dungeons and encounters that other players have to go through, and other players have different characters of their own. The thing about Dungeons and Dragons isn't necessarily about how it works well, but how it sometimes doesn't. And oftentimes the dungeon master might break the rules of the game to try and have something interesting happen. And this is what's really interesting about tabletop RPGs, is that these rules are used as a guideline, and you can completely change them if you need to. Dungeons and Dragons is about building a world and having characters interact with that, but sometimes the theme of a fantasy world with dwarves and elves might seem a little bit overplayed or a little bit dull in comparison to some of the other tabletop RPGs that exist out there. So if you're looking for something a bit different to D&D, there is Shadowrun. Now, Shadowrun is set in a cyberpunk future world where you play as different characters undergoing unlawful jobs trying not to get noticed by the authorities. Now, Shadowrun is a lot darker than D&D because you have this dystopian future world where you have authorities trying to get you, and you have people betraying and backstabbing you all the time, so there's a lot more engaging story that can happen inside this game. Now, the difference between a lot of these storytelling games and these tabletop RPGs is that the actions the character takes can influence the story far more than the cards that you're forced to play. So there's a lot more depth that can happen. And so you start to develop an attachment to these characters, their own little quirks and attributes, and because most of the events are determined by dice rolls, there's always a chance that you're just going to make a massive mistake. You might be in a massive firefight and decide to throw out a grenade to try and disperse all the enemies. Until you hit the beam just above the window, it bounces back and kills all of your party members in the most fantastically horrible way. If you want to try a fantasy game in a modern setting, however, there is Vampire the Masquerade, where players play as vampires in part of a secret society in modern day times, where they try to keep their identity secret from mortals around them. Vampire the Masquerade is a political game where you're trying to keep your identity secrets and try and form allegiances with each other. It's quite a lot of fun, quite a straightforward sort of-ish game, and there's a fantastic video game out there called Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which I would highly recommend. Alright, so to keep going on about some of these other tabletop RPGs, there's also an interesting one out there called Paranoia. And this one is another one of those dystopian futures, but it does a bit of a twist, where it's in a future where everyone doesn't really know what's going on, and everyone thinks everyone else is a traitor. Paranoia is set where there is a computer that dictates what everyone is doing with their particular lives, and so you play as a series of clones that have to try and work together to accomplish a goal that the computer has said. But the computer is telling you that that player is a traitor or that player is a traitor, and there's different security clearances that everyone has, so you're having to work together despite the fact that you think everyone's a traitor and a paranoid, and because it's just so crazy weird, you just can't help but feel a bit paranoid, hence the name. Now, the key with a lot of those games is that they're focused primarily around dice rolls to add that element of randomness. But there's one tabletop RPG that does something different, and this is a horror game named Dread. Now, Dread doesn't have a simple dice roll mechanic. Instead, to perform exceptional acts, you have to play a game of Jenga. As players are trying to escape some abysmal horror, they have to carefully move this Jenga tower, trying not to knock over all the blocks, because if the tower is destroyed, their character is instantly killed. Which adds so much more tension to these games, which works very well with that horror theme. So there are many tabletop RPGs out there. There are thousands of them that are available, each with their own little quirks and styles. Many of them are freely available, so I definitely recommend checking them out. The thing about these tabletop RPGs is that while there is a dungeon master that dictates what happens and determines how the encounter unfolds, there are also players that are doing their individual actions to try and subvert that and change the course of nature, as it were. And these dice rolls or Jenga towers or other mechanics can help add randomness that means that no one knows what's actually going to happen in these campaigns. These board games and tabletop RPGs are really great because it's a great cooperative feeling as everyone is responsible in some way for some small part of the story. There's no competition involved, it's all a bit of fun. And most of these great board games will incorporate some small element of storytelling, whether that be from the flavor text in the side, but everything in there will be used to hold it all together to create something interesting and unique. And so the villain steed is slain, And as the final slash of the sword pierces him, he lies in a pool of his own blood. And he looks up to the party and he says...
Ooh, it says, please leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you next time here at the Board Game Nights.
Lying in a pool of his own blood, he looks up to the party and he says... There goes the dice. I can't do that.